In Lilholm, people were afraid of being alone. Every 10 to 15 years after Valentine's Day, a new body would be found in this small town. A woman. Young, beautiful, full of life, until her heart was torn from her chest. And each time, a keychain was found next to the body, a tiny leather heart on a chain. It might have seemed like an insignificant trinket, if not for one chilling fact. The material it was made from was not artificial. Maria grew up with this fear. Since childhood, she had been taught, you must not be alone by February 14th. It had become a town tradition, something akin to an ancient superstition. By mid-January, cafes, restaurants, and flower shops experienced a real boom. Everyone rushed to find a partner, even if just for a couple of weeks, because if you were alone, you were at risk. But this year, things were different. Maria no longer believed in these tales. Yes, bodies were found. Yes, the police never caught the killer. Yes, all the victims had their hearts removed. But that didn't mean some kind of demon was behind it all, right? Lilholm was a small Danish town near the German border, with narrow streets and the typical European architecture of small Scandinavian towns. Maria walked through its winding streets, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. The streetlights barely illuminated the road, and the fresh snow crunched beneath her feet. The little Scandinavian town, nestled between snow-covered hills, was cozy but eerie. It felt as if winter never truly ended here. It only shifted through different shades of gray. Shop windows were already decorated with hearts, red ribbons, and chocolate shaped like lips. It all looked unnatural, like bloodstains on white snow. Don't you think that this year the victim could be you? Her friend's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Maria glanced at Elin. She was clutching a cup of coffee, her blonde hair tucked under a knitted hat. It's just a legend, Elin. Someone is killing women, but that doesn't mean there's a curse behind it. But why always right after Valentine's Day? Why every year? Maria didn't know what to say. Maybe someone was deliberately cultivating this aura of horror. Maybe the real killer was simply toying with the town's superstitions. But the people of Lilholm preferred not to take any chances. They found themselves a partner. Those who weren't lucky enough to do so settled for random encounters, just to make sure they weren't alone on that day. Maria didn't want to give in to panic. She was 26, worked at a library, and lived alone in a small apartment with huge windows and shelves overflowing with books. She didn't have a boyfriend, and she wasn't about to get one just because of some legend. Tomorrow we're going to the bar, Elin declared, brushing snow off her coat. Was that a question or an order? It's common sense. You can't be alone. Maria rolled her eyes but didn't argue. They crossed the bridge over the frozen canal. Somewhere ahead, cheerful voices echoed. Someone was playing in the snow. The evening was quiet, almost perfect. But Maria felt something strange, as if someone was watching her from the darkness. She turned sharply. The street behind them was empty. Only the wind whistled between the houses, howling through the alleys. What's wrong? Ellen stopped, following Maria's gaze. Maria shook her head. Nothing. Just my imagination. They reached the square where their favorite cafe was located, a small, cozy place with wooden tables and the scent of fresh pastries. It was always warm here, even in the harshest winter. The waitress smiled at them and led them to their usual table by the window. Maria watched the passers-by hurrying about their business, the way the streetlights reflected on the snow. Everything looked peaceful, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. She ran a hand through her hair and sighed. I'm losing my mind. No, you're just nervous. About what? Ellen shrugged. Maybe because you're the only one who doesn't believe in the curse? Maria wanted to argue, but at that moment, the cafe door opened, and he walked in. Tall, with a casual grace in his movements, wearing a perfectly tailored coat the color of midnight. A man who looked far too elegant for their provincial town. He brushed the snow off his shoulders and scanned the room. For a brief second, their eyes met, and Maria felt a chill run down her spine. She tore her gaze away from her coffee cup and looked at him again. He stood at the counter, lazily glancing at the menu, as if choosing something, though it was clear he didn't really care. The order was just for show. Tall, dressed in an expensive coat, with well-kept yet slightly rough hands, he looked like someone accustomed to luxury but not obsessed with it. His black hair was a little longer than what was considered proper for a businessman, but neat enough not to seem unkempt. When the barista spoke to him, he smiled, polite, a little lazy, as if the conversation held no real significance for him. But the most striking thing about him, his eyes. They were deep, dark, like a black lake on a polar night. And within that darkness, there was a fire, hungry, predatory, hidden behind a slight half-smile. Maria shook off the strange feeling and took a sip of coffee. "So? What do you think of him?" Aylin suddenly asked, catching her glance. "Who?" "That man. He's looking at you." Maria had no intention of turning around, but she couldn't help herself. Their eyes met again. The man, without looking away, gave her a slight smile. Instead of turning away, he slowly, almost lazily, started walking toward their table. "Excuse me, but do you have a pen?" His voice was low, slightly husky, but pleasant. Maria blinked. Yes, of course." Maria reached into her bag, pulled out a black gel pen, and handed it to him. He took it as if it were a rare gift, rather than just an ordinary office supply. "Thank you. I suppose I should introduce myself. I'm Victor." Maria tensed slightly. "Maria." He nodded slightly, as if her name was no surprise to him. "A beautiful name. It suits you." She didn't know what to say. Elin immediately jumped in. "You're not from around here, are you?" "You could say that. I move around a lot, but I've decided to stay here for a while." "What do you do?" "Oh, nothing special. Investments, real estate. Sounds boring, but it pays the bills." Victor smiled. Aylin seemed satisfied with the answer, but Maria couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Meanwhile, Victor pulled out his phone. Maria glanced at it and frowned. "How old is your phone? 10 years?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. Victor smirked, unfazed. "Unfortunately, I haven't had time to upgrade. Always too busy." Maria didn't know why this detail bothered her. Rich people were always the first to get the latest tech. Something didn't add up. "Can I have your number?" Victor handed her his phone, offering her to enter her contact. Maria hesitated for a second, but then typed it in. "Just in case you'd like to continue our conversation." He smiled again, this time a little wider. "It was a pleasure meeting you." He lingered for a moment before turning and heading for the exit. Maria realized only after he left that she could finally breathe normally again. "So, what do you think of him?" Ellen asked, watching her closely. Maria didn't answer. She simply looked out the window, where Victor had already disappeared into the crowd. There were less than 3 weeks left until Valentine's Day. "You're not getting out of this," Ellen declared firmly, gripping Maria's arm. "Aylin, is this really necessary?" Maria sighed as her friend practically dragged her through the snowy streets. "Your mom agrees with me, and when she says you need to get out more, you listen." Maria grimaced. That morning's conversation with her mother had left her no choice. "You can't just stay home all the time, sweetheart," her mother had said over the phone. "You're young, you're beautiful, you need to go out and meet people. I know this day stresses you out, but everything will be fine. Just promise me you'll go have some fun." Making the promise had been easy. Stepping through the doors of the old bar, however, was much harder. The bar was in the center of Lilholm, housed in a century-old building. Inside, the air smelled of wood, bitter ale, and a faint trace of smoke from the fireplace. The dim lighting gave the place a cozy atmosphere, and the murmur of voices nearly drowned out the soft music playing in the corner. "The whole town is here," Maria muttered, taking off her coat. "Of course. Everyone wants to make sure they won't be alone by February 14th. Elin smirked and led her toward an empty table. Maria had just started to relax when she saw him. Victor sat at the bar, lazily twirling a glass of dark ale between his fingers. He noticed her almost instantly, his gaze lingering for just a moment. Something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable, but he quickly masked it with that same slow, almost lazy smile that radiated effortless confidence. "Did you invite him here?" Maria shot her friend a suspicious look. "Me? Number maybe it's fate?" Elin winked and, without waiting for an answer, waved at Victor. Maria didn't even have time to protest before Victor was already standing and walking toward them. "What a surprising coincidence," he said as he approached their table. "A coincidence," Maria muttered. "I don't believe in coincidences," Victor replied smoothly and took a seat across from her. The waiter took their orders. A glass of white wine for Maria, a cocktail for Elin, and another dark ale for Victor. He blended into the conversation effortlessly, as if he had always been part of their group. He spoke confidently, pleasantly, with a hint of irony. "There used to be an amazing pub here," he remarked, glancing around. "I remember they had fantastic ale." Maria froze, studying his face. "You couldn't have known that." Victor raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. "That pub was torn down over 30 years ago. A cafe replaced it and then this bar, unless you lived in Lilholm as a child." For a brief moment, a shadow passed through his eyes. Something sharp, something cold. A flash of a snarl, too cruel to belong to a human being. But just as quickly, he relaxed and smirked. "I must have heard stories and remembered them as if I were here myself. People tend to adopt others' memories, don't they?" The answer sounded unconvincing. Too unconvincing for someone who had been so certain just moments ago. A strange, sticky cold crept over Maria's skin. She took a sip of wine, hoping to shake the feeling. "You're too serious, Maria," Victor observed her. "Sometimes you just need to enjoy the moment." She didn't answer. That evening, she did manage to relax a little, even laugh. But the unease never left her. Her apartment greeted her with its usual silence. She took off her coat, hung it on the hook, and walked to the bathroom. Turning on the water to wash her face, she bent over the sink. When Maria straightened up, her heart skipped a beat. There was something on the fogged-up mirror. Not words, not fingerprints. Eyes, glowing, eerie, inhuman eyes staring at her from deep within the reflection. For a fraction of a second, as her mind struggled to comprehend what she was seeing, a distorted face flickered in the mirror. Horns, hollowed-out cheeks, a twisted grin. Maria whirled around with a strangled gasp. There was nothing behind her. Gripping the edge of the sink, she tried to steady her breathing. But when she looked back at the mirror, a symbol had appeared in the condensation. A heart. Maria stumbled backward, barely stopping herself from screaming again. She squeezed her eyes shut, counted to 5, and forced herself to look again. The heart was still there, but now it was smudging, as if someone was slowly erasing it with a fingertip. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. "It's just my mind playing tricks on me. Just steam from the water." She reached out and wiped the mirror clean with a sharp motion, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. She lay in bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, staring into the darkness. Outside, the wind howled, but now it sounded disturbingly like laughter, slow, drawn out, and quiet. Maria squeezed her eyes shut. Less than 3 weeks until Valentine's Day. Maria didn't tell anyone what had happened that night. She couldn't get Victor out of her mind. He had left a strange, contradictory impression. On the surface, he was polite, calm, charming. But beneath it, something about him made her uneasy. The mere memory of him sent an unpleasant chill down her spine. If everyone in town feared being alone before Valentine's Day, then Victor was a perfect candidate for the role. Maria didn't want a relationship, but she also didn't want to become the next victim. She didn't believe in legends, dismissing the murders as the work of a serial killer, or maybe a group of copycats. Could there be any other explanation? With these thoughts swirling in her mind, she stepped into the library. Here, among old books and dusty newspaper clippings, Maria felt safe. This place was her home, her fortress. She sat at the farthest table, spread out the folders in front of her, and began her search. February 14th, year after year. Brutal murders, bodies found without hearts, investigations that led nowhere. She flipped through newspapers, catching repeating details, and then her fingers trembled. A 1994 newspaper article. Woman's body found in park, heart torn out as if with bare hands. The victim's name was crossed out in pencil, but the description matched the most recent cases. A local woman, 26 years old, found without a heart, no signs of struggle. Maria traced her fingers over the old photograph, trying to make out the details. The black and white image didn't reveal much, but one thing caught her attention: a heart-shaped keychain. Tiny. Leather. The same as the ones found near the victims in recent years. She turned the page. Another article. 1983, another murder, another Valentine's Day, another heart-shaped keychain. Her breath hitched. 19th, 94th, 19th, 83rd, 19th, 71st. Every 9 to 10 years, a woman was murdered in exactly the same way. Always young, always found without a heart, always with the same keychain. Maria's fingers clenched the edges of the paper. A wave of icy fear washed over her. She had to stop. Close the newspapers, push it out of her mind. This was all just coincidence. But then, her eyes caught another detail. The 1971 article contained a witness statement. Someone had seen the victim shortly before her death. She had been with a man. Maria swallowed hard. The witness couldn't remember his face, but he said the man seemed strangely calm, almost unreal. She leaned back in her chair, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. So, it wasn't just about being alone. Everyone was at risk. Or was this man the killer? Maria stood up, shoved her chair back, and quickly walked toward the exit. She needed to forget about this. It was just a mistake, just a coincidence. And yet, she knew she wouldn't be able to get it out of her head. Because now, standing alone in the empty library among the dusty archives, she felt someone watching her, and that feeling was terrifyingly familiar. That night brought restless dreams. At first, Maria dreamed that she woke up in her bed. Everything was normal: the darkness outside, the ticking of the clock, the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. But something was wrong. There was a strange heaviness in her chest. Slowly, Maria lifted her hand, touched her skin, and her fingers sank into emptiness. Where her heart should have been, there was now a gaping hole, deep, black, with jagged edges. She felt no pain, but the realization of it hit her like a freezing wave of terror. Maria tried to scream, but only a hoarse gasp escaped her lips. The dream shifted. Now she was standing in the yard of her parents' house. In front of her sat their Doberman, Prince, large, strong, with sleek black fur. His brown eyes looked at her with the same loyalty he had always shown. But this time, she felt nothing for him, except hunger. Maria lowered her hand, her fingers instinctively closing around his chest. Prince didn't resist. She tore out his heart, feeling the hot blood spill over her hands. It was still beating, weakly pulsating in her grip. She woke up, gasping for air. The next day, Maria met with Aylin over coffee. Her friend immediately noticed how pale and exhausted she looked. "What's wrong with you?" Aylin frowned. Maria hesitated, but then told her about the nightmares, about the hole in her chest, about Prince. Aylin listened carefully, then shrugged. "That's not normal, Maria. You should see a therapist." "I don't go to therapists," Maria snapped, pushing her cup aside. "And especially not now. You know how busy they are before Valentine's Day. Half the town is in a panic." "Gee, I wonder why." Aylin smirked but quickly grew serious. "But really, this isn't okay. You're obviously on edge. Maybe you just need a distraction?" Maria nodded, but her thoughts were far away. She didn't want to see a psychologist. She didn't want to discuss this with anyone. That evening, she drove to her parents' house. Their home was on the outskirts of town, old, cozy, with large windows and a garden. Here, Maria always felt safe. But this time, that sense of security was just an illusion. As soon as she stepped inside, her mother started pressing her. "You're alone again?" she asked reproachfully while setting the table. "Maria, you're not a little girl anymore. You know it's dangerous. Everyone finds someone, even if just for a while. Why do you have to be so stubborn?" Her father stayed silent, but his gaze said the same thing. Maria clenched her fork. She was tired of these conversations. "I have a boyfriend." The words escaped her lips before she even realized what she was saying. Silence fell over the kitchen. Her mother froze, still holding a plate, then her face lit up with joy. "Really? Finally, who is he? What's his name? What does he do? When will you introduce us?" Maria swallowed hard. She hadn't thought this through. Now she had to figure out who exactly she had just promised to introduce to her parents. Maria walked home, her boots sinking into the snow-covered pavement. The thought of the upcoming conversation with her parents wouldn't leave her alone, and even worse, her own lie. She had never lied to them about something like this before, but this time, the pressure had been too much. "If I have to introduce someone," she pulled out her phone, and before she could change her mind, dialed Victor's number. Her heart clenched as his deep voice came through the speaker. "Maria?" She took a deep breath. "Hi, I know this is a strange request, but I need a favor. Could you pretend to be my boyfriend in front of my parents? I told them I have someone." A small pause. Then Victor laughed. "Unusual request, but it actually sounds fun. Where did we meet?" "The library. It'll seem believable. Then I'll see you soon, Maria." She ended the call and exhaled. Everything was under control. That night, the nightmares returned. She stood in her apartment, but the walls were covered in dark cracks, and thick scarlet blood poured from the shower. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. And when Maria finally came to her senses and bolted upright in bed, her heart was pounding violently. Everything seemed normal, but her skin was burning. She turned on the light and froze. On her chest, right above her heart, were scratches. Shallow but clear. And the most terrifying thing, they formed words. "Give me your heart." Maria froze, feeling a wave of terror constricting her chest. She touched the scratches, but they vanished, as if they had never been there. The next day, Victor arrived on time. He looked impeccable, polished but not overly formal, charming but restrained. Her parents greeted him with curiosity. Her father studied his face intently a few times before narrowing his eyes and saying, "You must be some kind of celebrity. Your face looks painfully familiar." Victor only smiled and gave a soft shrug. "Maybe I just have a classic face?" Maria froze, watching him closely. He behaved perfectly, answering questions smoothly, laughing at the right moments, creating the impression of someone safe, reliable, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hidden in his eyes, something she couldn't quite understand yet. The evening went smoothly. Even her mother seemed satisfied, which was a rare occurrence. When her parents finally bid them goodbye, Victor turned to Maria and suggested, "How about a walk tomorrow?" "You're too tense, Maria. You should relax." She nodded without even thinking. Something inside told her that maybe Victor wasn't so bad after all. There were only 5 days left until Valentine's Day, but Maria felt surprisingly at peace. For the past 2 nights, she had no nightmares. The anxiety that had haunted her seemed to fade, replaced by something lighter, almost comforting. Victor messaged her more frequently now, his tone always effortless, warm, sometimes with a hint of playful flirtation. She didn't even notice when she started looking forward to his messages or how quickly she began responding. The night before, he mentioned that he had bought a new phone, just so it would be easier to text her. It was a small thing, but for some reason, it made her smile. Maybe she should give him a chance. That evening, they had planned a simple walk. No formalities, no fancy dinner, just a quiet stroll through snow-covered Lilholm. Maria waited for him on the bridge in the city center. It was one of her favorite places. The view of the frozen canal, strings of fairy lights glowing in the frosty air, people leisurely walking by, some skating in the distance. The scent of cinnamon and hot chocolate drifted from nearby street cafes. She heard footsteps and turned. Victor was approaching. Once again, he wore a long, dark coat, but today he looked more relaxed. His usually perfect hair slightly tousled by the wind, a paper cup in each hand. "Did I guess right? You drink cinnamon latte, don't you?" he asked, handing her a cup. Maria smiled as she took the drink. "Almost. No sugar. I'll remember that for next time." They began walking along the canal, sipping their coffee, watching the city around them. The conversation flowed easily. Victor told her stories, how he almost drowned in a lake during a camping trip, how he got lost in a foreign city with no phone, wandering for hours until he accidentally stumbled upon the best restaurant of his life. "Do you travel alone?" Maria asked. "Most of the time." "Why?" "I don't know. I guess I've gotten used to being an observer. I like watching people, their emotions, their lives." Maria frowned slightly. "An observer? That sounds a little creepy." Victor laughed. "You make it sound like I'm some kind of stalker? No, I just like studying people. It's fascinating to see what drives them, what choices they make." Maria took a sip of her coffee, considering his words. There was something odd about it, but not disturbing enough to alarm her. They reached the main square, where a small winter market had been set up. The air was filled with the scents of mulled wine, pastries, and roasted nuts. Victor led her to a stall selling carved wooden trinkets. "Do you like things like this?" Maria ran her fingers over the tiny figurines. "They're cute, but I don't really collect them." Victor murmured something to the vendor, and a moment later he handed her a tiny wooden deer. "Let it remind you of tonight." She hesitated for a second, but eventually took it. Something warm spread in her chest. "Thank you, Victor." They continued walking for a long time, talking about books, movies, childhood memories. At some point, Maria realized that she no longer felt tense around him. On the contrary, being with Victor felt surprisingly easy. As the evening came to an end and they stood in front of her house, he suddenly said, "I'm glad you gave me a chance. Maybe we can do this again tomorrow?" Maria smiled. "We'll see." As she closed the door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this evening had been a little too perfect. Maria woke up feeling drained, as if the night had squeezed all the energy out of her. She couldn't remember her dreams, but she knew one thing. They had been nightmares, something dark, sticky, leaving behind an unsettling residue in her soul, but her mind stubbornly refused to recall the details. She glanced at her phone, 7:45 a.m., 4 days until Valentine's Day. Her thoughts immediately drifted back to Victor. They had been texting a lot over the past 2 days and she enjoyed it, but what exactly was between them? Friendship? Attraction? Or just a strange arrangement that she herself had suggested? She didn't know. Maria stepped outside, pulling on her gloves, and started walking through the morning streets. Snow crunched under her boots. Passers-by hurried to work. Her mind was busy with thoughts when suddenly something moved in her coat pocket. Not just moved, vibrated. It wasn't her phone. It wasn't her keys. It was something foreign, something alive. Her steps slowed. Her breath caught. The movement inside her pocket was rhythmic, pulsing, a thud, a beat, like a heartbeat. She froze in the middle of the street. People walked past her, but the world around her felt sluggish, unreal. With trembling fingers, she reached into her pocket, and her hand brushed against something warm and smooth. She pulled out her keys, and then a keychain. A leather heart, dark red, almost blood-colored. It was heavy, as if something dense lay hidden inside. And the smell, not the usual scent of leather. Something damp, metallic, the smell of blood. Her stomach twisted in terror. How did it get there? She was certain she had never put this on her keys. When she locked her door earlier, it hadn't been there. Where did it come from? Panic surged through her. She dropped the keychain onto the snow and stumbled backward. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounded wildly in her chest. People walked by. A few glanced at her. No one stopped. "This is impossible. This is some sick joke." Backing away, Maria tried to calm her racing thoughts. Her hands trembled. Her throat felt dry. Victor. Her fingers shook as she dialed his number. The ringing felt endless before she finally heard his familiar voice. "Maria? Are you okay?" No, damn it, Victor, this isn't normal." Her voice cracked as she pressed a hand over her ear, trying to block out the street noise. I found a keychain, a heart. It was in my pocket, but I never put it there." A pause on the other end. Then Victor spoke. "Where are you?" "Outside, near the library." "Stay there, I'm coming." Maria nodded, even though he couldn't see her, and ended the call. Then she immediately dialed Elin. "Can you meet me? Right now?" "Maria? What's wrong? You sound terrible." "Just, please, the cafe on Lindstrom Street in 15 minutes. "Okay, I'm on my way." Maria put away her phone, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing. Something terrible was coming. Maria stood still, waiting for the fear to loosen its grip on her. Her heart was still racing as she hesitantly took a step forward. The keychain. She had thrown it away, hadn't she? It had been right there, in the snow. With trembling fingers, she reached toward the spot where it had fallen, but it was gone. Only her keys remained. She picked them up, and in that moment, her gaze caught something, a faint reddish stain on the melting snow, as if something had dripped, something alive. Her stomach twisted. She clamped a hand over her mouth and took a few shaky steps backward. Her whole body trembled. "I'm losing my mind." Aylin was the first to arrive. The moment Maria spotted her, she rushed toward her friend. "What happened?" "You look like a ghost," Aylin exclaimed, concern etched on her face. I'll explain later. Let's just get to the cafe." They hurried forward. As they walked, Victor pulled up in his car and parked by the curb. He looked as composed as ever, but when his gaze landed on Maria's face, something flickered in his eyes. Was it worry? "What happened?" His voice was calm, but there was a tension in it. "Let's get inside first," Maria said, quickening her pace. They took a seat by the window in the cafe. Maria let out a deep breath and began explaining about how she had felt a heartbeat in her pocket, about the leather keychain and its metallic, bloody scent, about how she had thrown it away only for it to disappear. When she finished, a heavy silence settled at the table. Elin was the first to break it. "Are you sure you're not just imagining things?" she asked cautiously. "Maybe you're just stressed. The pressure, Valentine's Day, all those articles you've been reading. Honestly, this sounds like paranoia." Maria shook her head. "I know how it sounds, but it was real. I felt it. I know it was there." Elin folded her arms, clearly unsure what to say. Then, unexpectedly, Victor spoke, seriously, deliberately. "I've heard about these cases." Maria's head snapped toward him. "What?" Victor nodded. "I didn't come to this town by accident. I knew about the murders. I've been looking into them for a while." "Wait, what?" Elin stared at him, wide-eyed. "Are you serious?" Maria felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Victor looked completely calm, not surprised, not disturbed, as if he had expected this. "What do you know?" Maria whispered. Victor laced his fingers together, leaned forward slightly and said, "Despite the rumors, the women weren't necessarily alone. Yes, many of them were unmarried, but some of the victims had partners. It's just that they were alone in a different way." "What do you mean?" Elin frowned. There was only one common factor: a lonely heart. Victor's voice was low, controlled. These were women who had no one, or women in relationships where love had already died. Divorcing women, unhappy women, those whose hearts no longer belonged to anyone. Maria's fingers went cold against the surface of her cup. "So, It's a serial killer? You think someone is targeting these women on purpose? Victor tilted his head slightly. Maybe. It could be a serial killer. Or copycats. But I have a feeling it's something more. I've spoken to relatives of the victims, tried to piece things together. It all points to one thing. The killer punishes women for betrayal, for lost love, for the emptiness in their hearts. Ellen let out a slow breath. That's insane. This isn't just murder. It's some kind of twisted ritual. Maria's chest tightened. A lonely heart. Did she fall into that category? She suddenly stood up too fast, almost knocking over her cup. Maria! Victor's gaze followed her carefully. Aylin quickly changed the subject, noticing how pale Maria had gone. Okay, enough of this creepy nonsense. Let's talk about something fun, she announced with a forced smile. I'm going to a club on Valentine's Day. Let's all go together. Maria, Victor, what do you say? Maria struggled to pull herself out of her spiraling thoughts. You really think this is the time for clubs? It's exactly the time for clubs. The more people around, the safer we are, Elin said with a smirk. And you'll have Victor with you, so you're completely safe. She winked playfully at Maria, but Maria didn't answer. Maria knew one thing. She didn't feel safe, not even next to Victor. Victor offered to drive her home, but she refused. She didn't feel safe at home, and besides, she had to go to work. Without her, the library wouldn't open. I can wait for you or help if you want, Victor suggested as they pulled up in front of the library. Maria shook her head. Thank you, but I'd rather be alone. I want to look for more information about the leather hearts. Victor studied her for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind, but he didn't argue. Be careful, Maria. She nodded and stepped out of the car, feeling a growing sense of unease pressing down on her. Victor drove away, and she quickly entered the library, where the silence felt too heavy. Maria returned to the newspaper clippings. She had already gone through the old cases several times, but now she read them more carefully. She found the 1971 article again. There had been mention of a witness, but this time she noticed a crucial detail she had overlooked before, the exact name of the victim. Lillian Björk, 26 years old. Body found on the morning of February 15th. Heart removed. A leather heart-shaped keychain was found nearby. Maria's chest tightened. Lillian. She had been just as young as all the other victims. Maria glanced at the signature of the detective who led the case, then at the mention of the only witness. The name in the report was blurred, but if she could get the original police records. She pulled out her phone and dialed Stephen, a contact she had at the police station. Are you busy? Never for you, he replied with a slight chuckle. What's up? I need the name of a witness from a 1971 case. Can you find it? 1971? Maria, do you realize how old that archive is? Please, Stephen, it's important. The Lillian Björk case. Murder on February 14th, 1971. He exhaled. I'll try. No promises. If I find something, I'll let you know. Maria put her phone away and realized her fingers were trembling. For the first time, she felt like she was doing something. It was late when she left the library. The darkness had thickened, and the streets were nearly empty. She walked quickly, pulling her coat tighter around her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She turned. No one. But the air felt wrong. By the time she reached her apartment and locked the door behind her, a shudder ran through her body. She switched on all the lights and exhaled slowly. Everything was fine. Everything was under control. But as she passed the mirror, she saw something. A dark figure behind her. She spun around. Nothing. But in the reflection on the fogged-up glass, a word appeared. Soon. Maria had never felt fear like this before. A violent tremor coursed through her as she gripped the doorframe. Come out, coward! Who are you? Show yourself! She screamed into the empty apartment. Only silence answered her. Her throat tightened, and her eyes filled with tears. This is impossible. This can't be happening. She collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily, trying to calm herself, but then she smelled it. A sharp, suffocating scent. Blood, musk, fur, the smell of a wild animal tearing into its prey. She shot up from the floor, and the smell was gone. Nothing. No one. And then, the doorbell rang. The sound sliced through the silence of the apartment, making her heart leap. Maria swallowed, wiping away her tears, and cautiously stepped toward the door. The neighbor from downstairs, Ted. "Is something wrong?" he asked, frowning slightly. Maria took a deep breath. "Yes. No, just a nightmare." Ted gave her a doubtful look, but eventually nodded. "All right, if you need anything, call me. You know my number." Maria thanked him and was about to close the door when Ted suddenly called her name. "Maria?" She hesitated and opened the door again, and his eyes were glowing. Dark fur began to spread across his face, and horns slowly emerged from his head. "Give me your heart!" the creature before her snarled. Maria slammed the door shut, her hands shaking as she turned the lock. She collapsed onto the floor, scrambling backward, a choked scream escaping her throat. A dull thud echoed from outside. Then another. Something was pounding on the door with inhuman force. Maria clamped her hands over her ears, praying for it to stop. Knock, 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 fast, insistent, knock, 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 and then... silence. Only her own ragged breathing filled the room. And then, her phone rang. Maria flinched, grabbing the screen with trembling fingers. "Stephen." The phone vibrated in her hands as she struggled to answer. "Stephen?" "Maria, what's wrong? Are you crying?" His voice was filled with concern. She exhaled shakily, trying to regain control. "No, just a nightmare. A bit early for sleep, don't you think? You barely made it home." He chuckled, but then his tone turned serious. "I found the information you wanted, but you're not going to like it." Maria's grip on the phone tightened. "Why? Did the witness die?" A brief pause. "No, Maria. The witness was your father?" Maria froze. Something in her mind clicked, the world tilted. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely certain?" "Yes, Maria. He was 9 years old at the time. He was the last person to see her alive. He and the victim lived on the same street." Maria clutched the phone even tighter, trying to process what she had just heard. Her father. Why had he never told her? Why had he never once mentioned that he was connected to these murders? A storm of anxiety and dread surged inside her. She couldn't stay in this apartment. Not after what she had seen, not after what she had just learned. She dialed her mother's number. "Mom? I want to come over. I'll stay the night, okay?" "Of course, sweetheart. Are you all right?" "Yeah. Just tired. I need to talk." "All right. We'll be waiting for you." Maria ended the call, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. But when she turned to close it behind her, her entire body went rigid. On the surface of the door, smeared in something red, was a message. 3 days. Thick, uneven letters, as if written with fingers, just like in her nightmares. Maria inhaled sharply and realized it was blood. She staggered backward, her breath hitching. This couldn't be an illusion. It was real. Something, or someone, had left her a message. But she had no time to panic. She needed to leave. Now she snatched her keys, locked the door, and took off without looking back, heading straight to her parents' house. The truth awaited her. And she was afraid to learn what it would be. Maria drove, lost in thought. 3 days. It was February 11th. Exactly 3 days until Valentine's Day. She still didn't understand what was happening. Was this real? Or just a series of coincidences and imitators? Was someone playing with her mind? Who wrote on her door? A stalker? A neighbor? Or was it just a sick prank by teenagers? Had her neighbor Ted really come to her door? Or was that an illusion too? She shook her head, forcing the thoughts away, and focused on the road. She needed answers. At her parents' house, Maria sat at the kitchen table. They were drinking tea, as they always did before bed. A family tradition. Here, in this house, there was no fear. Here, nothing strange ever happened. Warmth, light, comfort, but she had to shatter this illusion. "Why did you always tell me I had to find a partner before Valentine's Day?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Sweetheart, we never forced you," her mother said gently. "And you have Victor now. He's a wonderful match." Maria cut her off. Yes, I get it. But ever since I became an adult, you kept telling me this. What's the real reason?" Her mother shrugged. "There's no reason, darling. We just wanted you to be happy." Maria's eyes shifted to her father. His face was tense. Or maybe, this is about the 1971 murder? A deafening silence filled the room. Her parents looked as if struck by lightning. Her father's expression darkened and he let out a heavy sigh. "I don't talk about that. I told the police and the press everything back then." Maria clenched her fists. "Dad, why have you never told me?" Her father met her gaze. "Told you what? That I saw our neighbor before she died? Number, that you actually believe in this? That you saw the possible killer? Didn't you realize there was nothing supernatural about these murders?" She paused, her voice steady. "Can you describe him?" Her father's head snapped up. His lips pressed into a thin, hard line. "No." His voice was sharp, firm. "What's the point? It was 50 years ago. The memories are already fading." Maria's mother gave her a reproachful look. "I think we all need some sleep," she said softly. They stood and went to their rooms. Maria lay in bed, but she couldn't sleep. Why had he reacted like that? Why did this scare him so much? She turned onto her side, staring into the darkness. Time dragged on, the silence in the house thick, suffocating. Then, a sound, a quiet scrape against the floor, somewhere in the hallway. Maria froze, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. She strained her eyes in the darkness, but saw nothing. A faint creak, like claws scratching against wood. She held her breath. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft taps against her door. Light, barely audible. She sat up in bed but didn't move. Silence. Then, a whisper. "Give me your heart." Maria jerked upright, clutching the blanket in her fists. She couldn't have imagined that. She heard it. A dark shadow flickered past the door. Tall, with horns. Maria shut her eyes and started counting. 1, 2, 3. When she opened them again, the silence was absolute, but the scent of musk and blood still lingered in the air. The next morning, Maria went to work at the library. After a restless night, she needed distraction, and among the quiet of books, she felt at least a little calmer. But the thought of everything happening around her wouldn't leave her mind. 2 days. Only 2 days left until Valentine's Day. She realized she didn't want to go home. The thought of being alone in her apartment sent a cold shiver down her spine. She could stay with Ellen, but since her friend had moved in with her boyfriend, that felt inconvenient. The idea of Victor crossed her mind, but their relationship wasn't close enough for her to just ask to stay over. A notification suddenly popped up, a message from Victor. "Will you go to the Valentine's Day party at the club with me?" Maria smiled. Her reply came instantly, without hesitation. "Yes." A few minutes later, she called Elin to share the news. "That's amazing," her friend squealed. "But you need to buy something appropriate. You remember the dress code, right?" Maria frowned. "What dress code?" "Well," Elin laughed. "On this day, our club has a little tradition. Everyone wears something revealing. Leather outfits, lingerie, seductive costumes, basically anything that makes sure you don't leave the club alone." Maria sighed and rolled her eyes. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely." Elin giggled. "If I weren't taken, I'd go completely naked." "Haha, hilarious. But I can't help you, work and all that. You'll have to handle it yourself." Accepting the inevitable, Maria went shopping. She wandered through boutiques, picking out one daring outfit after another. At some point, boredom kicked in, and she started sending pictures to Elin, asking for feedback. "This one?" The photo showed an elegant black dress with a deep neckline. "Too modest. Go bolder," Elin replied. Maria sighed and tried on another outfit. This one was wild, a leather corset, thigh-high stockings, and a mask. "Better?" she texted. "Ooh, getting warmer," came the instant reply. A few minutes later, Maria stepped into the fitting room with the most provocative outfit yet, a barely there ensemble made of knots and ropes, covering almost nothing. "And this one?" She snapped a mirror selfie and hit send. But when she glanced at the recipient's name, her heart stopped. She had sent it to Victor. Maria froze, blood rushing to her face. Her phone buzzed. "Victor is typing." Her phone buzzed in her hands, making her heart race wildly. Maria froze, staring at the screen. She took a deep breath and opened the message. Bold, unexpected, but I like it. Maria's face burned. She had no idea what to say. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "It was an accident." A reply came within seconds. "Really? I think you know exactly how to play games, Maria." Her mouth went dry. Was he flirting? Or was this something more? "Just forget it." "You want me to forget?" Victor seemed amused. Maria groaned in embarrassment, covering her face with her hands. Damn it. Another message. "All right, then I'll just remember." She leaned back against the fitting room wall, exhaling deeply, humiliating, but deep down, she knew. She liked it. Back at her apartment, Maria locked every door behind her. After last time, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. This time, no messages on the door, no blood, but that didn't mean it was over. Lying in bed, she opened her chat with Victor again. She stared at his last message for a long time. "Then I'll just remember." What did she really know about him? Why had he appeared in her life now? Why was he so interested in this case? She closed her eyes. Victor? Was he a threat? Or her salvation? She fell asleep with that question lingering in her mind. Maria was back in the dark room. A man stood before her, tall, a shadowy silhouette, eyes burning. He was staring right at her. "Your heart has already been chosen." She flinched, a step back. The darkness closed in. "Who are you?" She tried to scream, but her voice sounded muffled. The figure stepped closer. She recognized his voice. "You know who I am." Maria woke up screaming. Maria exhaled, staring at herself in the mirror. A bold black corset hugged her curves, stockings, straps, and high heels completing the look. She looked like she was heading to a masquerade of desire, not just a party, but tonight wasn't an ordinary night. She stepped out of the taxi, where Ellen was already waiting. A fiery red bodysuit with thin chains, stockings, and bare shoulders, her friend looked like a true fatal seductress. "Maria, you look incredible," Ellen gasped. "Now I understand why Victor looks at you the way he does." Ellen's boyfriend, Sean, looked just as impressive. An open shirt, leather straps, and dark pants that highlighted his muscular frame. And then Maria saw Victor. A black button-down, slightly undone, emphasizing his broad shoulders. Leather pants, perfectly fitted. He looked dangerous, irresistible. As he approached, his gaze lingered on her, his lips curving into a subtle smile. "You look stunning." Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she only huffed, averting her gaze. "Let's go inside." The moment they entered, Maria froze. Pink neon lights, velvet walls with intricate patterns, floating feathers, LED cascades glittering in glasses of champagne. The bass throbbed, creating a thrilling chaos. People in daring outfits danced on the floor, laughing, kissing, slipping into private rooms where behind closed doors, anything could happen. Maria swallowed, taking it all in. The atmosphere was intoxicating. "Want a drink?" Victor leaned in, his voice deep, velvety against her ear. "Yes, but just one cocktail." The bartender placed something pink, rimmed with sugar in front of her. Maria took a sip, sweet, with a hint of bitterness. "Dance with me?" Victor asked. She almost said no, but then she thought, why not? Tonight she wouldn't be afraid. They moved on to the dance floor, and Maria felt Victor's hands gently but firmly settle on her waist. The music pulsed. She moved, following the rhythm, but also feeling his warmth, his hands, his breath against her skin. Victor's movements were slow, deliberate, as if every step had meaning. At one point, she turned to face him. Their eyes met, close, dangerously close. And then, he leaned in. She didn't pull away. Their lips met. The club vanished. No people, no music, no noise. Only this kiss. Victor's lips were soft but insistent. Maria clutched his shirt, feeling her heart race. "Let's go," she whispered before she could stop herself. Victor held her gaze for a moment, intense, searching, then nodded. The door closed, cutting off the club's noise. Maria licked her lips, nervous. A soft red glow filled the room. Velvet furniture, a faint scent of vanilla, and something deeper, muskier. She turned around. Victor was already sitting on the couch. His shirt was unbuttoned, revealing his sculpted chest. He leaned forward lazily, running a hand through his hair, then beckoned her closer with a finger. Maria stepped forward, her heart pounding loudly. Victor slowly pulled her toward him, his fingers gliding down her back. With effortless skill, he unhooked her corset, leaving her half exposed before him. But then, her phone rang. The screen lit up. "Dad." Maria irritably dismissed the call, but a second later, it rang again. She struggled to tear herself away from Victor, but suddenly, something clicked in her mind. Her mother had a heart condition. She snapped out of it, quickly covering her chest with one arm, turned her back to Victor, and answered the call. "Yes, Dad?" A shaky breath came through the line. "Maria, I don't know if this means anything, but I just remembered something." Her father hesitated. "Victor looks eerily like that guy, back in 71? Maria froze. "Maria, hello? Can you hear me?" She swallowed hard. "Yes, Dad, I'll call you back. Thanks for telling me." She slowly lowered the phone from her ear. A memory flashed in her mind. Her father had already mentioned that Victor seemed familiar. Back then, he thought he had seen him on TV. Not on TV. Not at all. A cold chill raced down her spine. She looked down. Hanging from her belt was a leather heart-shaped keychain. It was pulsing, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. The air thickened with a scent she had smelled before, in her nightmares, in the horrific illusions that had haunted her for days. Musk, blood, damp fur. Her body tensed. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. Before her stood a creature. It was massive, towering over 3 meters tall, its entire body covered in coarse black fur. Long, twisted horns stretched toward the ceiling. Its fiery eyes glowed in the dim light, and razor-sharp fangs hung from its maw. It breathed heavily, a primal growl vibrating through the air like a wild beast. Maria gasped. It reminded her of someone. But no, this is impossible. This is a myth. You're a demon? Her voice shook. The creature laughed, a low, bone-chilling rumble that vibrated through her chest. No. It took a step forward, the floor trembling beneath its weight. "My name is Krampus." Maria staggered back, her entire body trembling. This isn't real." "Oh, but you've always known I exist, Maria. You've felt me." It leaned down, almost close enough to touch her hair. Its breath was warm but reeked of blood. "Give me your heart." She jerked away, her back slamming against the wall. "No!" Krampus snarled, and in a flash his massive clawed hand seized her by the hair. "You think you have a choice?" He dragged her forward, lifting her effortlessly into the air as if she were nothing more than a rag doll. "Let me go," Maria screamed, her nails digging into his fur, but it was useless. "Your heart has already been chosen." He yanked her closer, and suddenly, the world disappeared. Maria felt a piercing cold, like being thrown into an icy abyss. She crashed onto a hard surface, pain jolting through her body. A groan escaped her lips as she pushed herself up onto her elbows. She looked around. She didn't recognize this place. A vast, desolate land stretched endlessly around her. In the distance, dark mountains loomed, their peaks shrouded in swirling black clouds. The sky was red, as if stained with blood. A horrible stench filled the air, the stench of death. The twisted branches of dead trees reached toward the sky like clawed fingers. This wasn't her world. This was his world. "Welcome to my domain, Maria." Krampus dragged her by the hair, his claws digging into her skin. Maria struggled, but his grip was unyielding. Her legs scraped against the frozen ground, leaving behind a trail of blood. Around them, towering fir trees stood, dark and menacing, their branches bent under the weight of snow. But when Maria looked closer, she realized. At first, the trees appeared decorated, as if strung with festive garlands. But then she understood the source of the smell. Not garlands, entrails, twisted intestines stretched between branches, woven into macabre patterns. And at the tops of the trees, no stars, no angels, human heads. Maria screamed. Krampus smirked, never stopping as he dragged her forward. "Do you like my decorations?" he mocked. "Naughty children. I'm not allowed to punish them like this anymore." The entire forest was filled with these ghastly trees. Every tree was adorned with human remains, their frozen faces twisted in terror. Maria tried not to look, but her gaze kept drifting back to the nightmare around her. "You're a monster!" Her voice broke. Krampus yanked her forward, making her stumble and collapse onto her knees. "I am what has always existed," he growled, "and what will always exist." After what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the forest. Maria saw his dwelling, a fortress rising from jagged black cliffs, a massive, ruined castle shrouded in smoke. Its towers were broken, its roofs rusted, yet its walls still loomed, ominous, like the very essence of this world. The stench of burning flesh and blood thickened the air. The gates stood open, revealing shifting shadows inside. Creatures. They crawled, scuttled, scratched at the stone with their claws. "What is this place?" "My home." Krampus turned to her with a wicked grin. "And now, yours." He hauled her through the gates, and the icy air was instantly replaced by suffocating heat. Inside the fortress, the air was dense, oppressive, saturated with the stench of scorched flesh and sulfur. Her legs barely held her upright, her body exhausted, her mind feverishly trying to comprehend what was happening. "Let me go," she rasped. Krampus ignored her. He dragged her further down a long, dark corridor, its walls etched with ancient runes, pulsing with a dull red glow. Chains hung from the walls, stained with dried blood. From somewhere deep within the fortress, distant moans and whispers echoed. Maria shivered. Krampus only let out a low, guttural laugh. "You're the first to ever make it here." She froze. "What?" Her voice was weak. Krampus turned to her, his fiery eyes burning with irritation and fury. "Everyone before you willingly gave me their hearts." Maria's stomach clenched. They sought pleasure, power, wealth. They weren't evil, but they were weak. They craved indulgence, and I knew their desires. I fulfilled their secret wishes, and in return, they whispered the sacred words. They gave their hearts to me, of their own free will. Krampus spoke with pride, his voice laced with satisfaction. Maria shook her head. "You seduced them. You preyed on those who were vulnerable." Krampus chuckled. "I gave them a choice." His claws traced lightly along her cheek, sending a cold shiver down her spine. "But you ruined everything." He leaned in, his breath scorching against her skin. 500 years. His voice hardened. "For 5 centuries I perfected this ritual. When I was forbidden from taking disobedient children, I devised something new. I made Valentine's Day what it is. I created the tradition of giving hearts, and now, you've ruined it." Maria felt goosebumps rise across her skin. "Lilholm is my favorite city. I've returned here more than anywhere else." His claws tightened around her chin, forcing her to look at him. "And you have destroyed what I've built for 500 years. His eyes blazed with fury. "Do you think I'll let you go so easily?" His voice rumbled, thick with hatred. "You will be my final sacrifice. No one gave me a heart this time, but you will pay for it." He fisted her hair and, with a vicious jerk, threw her onto the cold stone floor. Maria choked, gasping for breath, but his shadow loomed over her. "I will break you," he growled, "all night, until you die." His claws clamped around her wrists, and a predatory smirk curled his lips. "Let's see how long you last, or you can surrender now." His grip tightened. "Give me your heart, and it will be over quickly." Maria gasped for air, feeling his sharp claws dig into her skin. Her heart pounded, but not from fear, from rage, from the sheer refusal to surrender. "You can give me your heart, and it will all be over quickly." Krampus smiled, but in his eyes, only dark malice burned. "Or I'll take it myself." Maria gritted her teeth, her chest rising and falling heavily. She knew, if she said those words, if she gave in, her heart would no longer belong to her. She would become just another piece of his ritual, another broken soul, another conquered weakness. "No," Krampus growled, his claws sinking deeper into her wrists, carving into her skin. Pain flared, but she refused to scream. "You're stubborn." He tore away the fabric of her upper clothing, leaving her half exposed on the cold, unforgiving stone floor. His claws traced along her skin, slow and deliberate, leaving thin, bleeding lines in their wake. But he wasn't rushing. "I have time." His sharp nails glided across her shoulder, savoring the way she flinched under his touch. "I enjoy the process." Maria stared at him, her breath ragged, but there was no fear in her eyes, only rage. "You think you'll break me?" Her voice was hoarse but steady, unyielding. "You're just a monster hiding behind a ritual to make yourself feel important," Krampus snarled, seizing her throat, lifting her off the ground effortlessly. "You don't understand what you're saying." "Oh, I do." Maria gasped for air, her fingers digging into his wrist, but she never looked away. "You chose me, but you made a mistake. I'm not your victim." His grip tightened, the air crushed from her lungs, but for a split second, something shifted in his gaze. Doubt. "You will be mine." His voice wavered, just slightly. "All women break eventually. Then I'll be the first who won't." Maria swung her elbow, hard, into his jaw. Krampus stumbled back, his grip loosening, and Maria crashed to the ground, barely managing to brace herself. She couldn't defeat him in a fight, but she could endure. Krampus glared down at her, something new flickering across his face. Interest. "Let's see, Maria." His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Let's see how long you last." It was the worst night of her life. Pure, merciless violence, a perverted cruelty, a desecration, twisted into ritual. Krampus savored her pain, drank in her suffering, but she did not surrender. Maria never spoke the sacred words. She knew, if she survived, she would never be the same. Krampus tore her apart slowly, methodically, prolonging her agony, but he never got what he truly desired. He flayed the skin from her legs, leaving raw muscle exposed to the icy air. Pain invaded every cell of her body, but she did not scream. He bit off her left hand, staring into her eyes, searching for the terror he craved. But she did not beg. He forced her to chew her own finger. Still, she remained silent. Maria felt her body breaking, her mind slipping away. Whether from pain or blood loss, she didn't know. She plunged into darkness, barely hearing his roar of frustration before everything faded to nothing. And then, silence. Maria shot up with a scream. She was in her bed, in her apartment, whole, unharmed. She lifted her hands, both wrists intact. Her legs were fine, but her breath was ragged, her heart hammering wildly. Was it a dream? An illusion? Or something worse? She scanned the room. Everything looked normal, except, on her nightstand, something waited. A box. Maria reached out slowly, as if afraid to touch it. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a keychain, withered, lifeless. It no longer pulsed. She understood. The curse was broken. Beneath the keychain, something else was waiting. A letter, neatly folded, like a love note. Maria unfolded it, her vision blurring as she read the words. As it is tradition to give one's heart to a beloved, take mine. There was no signature. Her fingers shook violently. She slowly unwrapped the final layer of paper and froze. At the bottom of the box sat a ruby, heart-shaped, the size of a fist. Maria's stomach twisted violently. Her throat tightened, a wave of nausea crashed over her. She barely made it to the bathroom before she threw up. Maria, still in shock, dialed Ellen's number. The dial tone dragged on endlessly until finally, her friend picked up. "Maria, are you even alive? I thought you died after the club." Maria swallowed hard, trying to figure out what to say. "Ellen? What happened at the club?" Ellen snorted and laughed. "What happened? You disappeared. I just remember you leaving with Victor. I thought your night was so wild you don't even remember." Maria felt her palms grow clammy. We left?" Her voice trembled. "Well, yeah. Where did you two go? His place? Yours? A hotel?" Ellen's voice was playful, teasing. "So, how was it?" Maria hung up without answering. Days passed, but the fear never left. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. The ruby lay locked away in her closet, but its presence weighed on her, like a ghost of the past. And then, the strangest thing began to happen. Morning sickness, dizziness, nausea. At first, she blamed stress, but then something deep inside her whispered the truth. She bought a test, returning home with shaking hands. The 5-minute wait felt like an eternity. Maria slowly lifted the test stick. 2 lines. She was pregnant. And then, a whisper filled her ears. A voice she would never forget.
"Now you are mine."
Subscribe to the channel to receive new horror stories before bed. Like, write in the comments who at what time does not sleep under our audiobook.